The night my wife came home smelling like cologne that wasn't mine, I told myself I was imagining things. 6 months later I had photos, GPS logs, and a choice: burn quietly, or burn it all down. Hey everyone, glad to have you back. I appreciate you taking the time. Today I've got a new story to share, one I never thought I'd be the guy telling. So here it goes. The digital clock on my nightstand blinked 9:17 p.m. in bright red, each number burning itself into my eyes like it was trying to accuse me of something. It had been weeks since I'd had a decent night's sleep. Not since the evening Emily came home for the first time smelling faintly of a cologne I didn't recognize. Now, here I was, lying alone in the middle of our oversized bed, while she was supposedly stuck at yet another urgent meeting with a client. And for the first time, I allowed myself to truly accept what I'd been trying to ignore for so long. This marriage was already dead. And I was the only one still trying to breathe life into it. I first met Emily 12 years ago, back in the university library. We'd both reached for the same economics textbook and our hands brushed. It sounds like something pulled straight out of a bad romance novel, and honestly thinking about it now makes me feel sick. But back then she was stunning. She still is. Only now, her beauty doesn't feel like a blessing anymore. Feels like a weapon, sharp and cold, pointed right at me. That night in the library turned into study sessions that lasted until the building closed, and those sessions turned into dinners. I ended up proposing to her at a little French bistro, the same place we'd had our first proper date. The engagement ring cost me 3 months' worth of my salary from teaching at the time, but the way she cried when I slipped it on her finger made every penny feel worth it. Our honeymoon in Santorini is still burned into my memory like it happened yesterday, the whitewashed buildings clinging to the cliffs, the endless blue of the Aegean stretching out into forever, and that old olive tree where we carved our initials like we were still teenagers. I'd written Jake plus Emily forever, inside a heart, and for the first time in my life I actually believed in the word forever. Back then the other teachers at Lincoln High used to tease me about how lucky I was. My buddy Kevin from the math department would smack me on the back in the break room and laugh. Man, with a wife like that, you must have struck gold. Bet you made a deal with the devil. If only he knew, the devil always comes to collect. Everything started shifting about 6 months ago when Emily got promoted to senior account director at her marketing agency. We celebrated with a quiet dinner at home, just the two of us. But that simple dinner quickly became champagne toasts at her office. And before long, those champagne nights turned into after-hours client meetings. Those client dinners started turning into full-blown conferences. Then came the late-night meetings and those so-called weekend strategy sessions. Before I even realized what was happening, Emily's phone, once just another object tossed carelessly around the house, became something precious, guarded. Suddenly she wouldn't let it out of her sight. She'd flip it over whenever we were eating, started bringing it with her even into the bathroom, and I eventually noticed she was sleeping with it tucked beneath her pillow, like it was some secret she needed to protect. The first time she didn't come home until nearly 3 in the morning, I was pacing the living room, sick with worry. When she finally walked through the door, she slipped into bed with the kind of practiced weariness that only comes from rehearsing. She mumbled something about a server crash at work, how the whole system had gone down and she had to manage the fallout. Then she leaned over and kissed me goodnight. But that kiss, it didn't taste like her. Her lips tasted of some fancy whiskey we never kept in the house, something smoky and expensive. Her hair carried the sharp, stale scent of cigarettes, even though she'd given up smoking 5 years ago, back when we made a pact to get healthier together. I laid there in the dark, heart pounding, trying to convince myself I was being irrational. That maybe I was just tired, reading too much into things. That maybe all those years teaching high schoolers had just made me overly suspicious. But the truth is, once you've spent 15 years in front of teenagers trying to wriggle out of homework with elaborate lies, you develop a sixth sense. You learn to read the subtle cues, the way eyes dart upward and to the left when someone's inventing a story, the way too many specific details are meant to sell a lie rather than tell the truth, and that quick flash of anger when you dare to ask questions. And that's exactly what Emily had started doing. All the tells I'd seen 1,000 times from students were now showing up in the woman I'd built a life with. The woman who once stood beside me and vowed to love me until the end. One night, I found myself just standing in our bedroom, staring at her half of the closet. I couldn't move. I just stood there, breathing slowly, taking it all in. The red lingerie I'd saved up for and given her on our anniversary was missing. The black silk nightgown I surprised her with last Valentine's Day, gone. A few days later, both pieces would magically show up again, freshly washed, neatly hung, carrying the scent of a detergent I didn't recognize. Something luxurious. Something we'd never bought. Her wardrobe had started changing too. The modest, professional outfits she used to wear to work were slowly replaced. In their place came shorter skirts, deeper necklines, fabrics that clung to her body in ways that made my stomach twist. Not because I thought she looked bad, she looked incredible. But because I knew exactly who she was dressing for. And it wasn't me. She wasn't dressing for me anymore. That much was clear. My phone vibrated on the nightstand and I reached for it, already knowing what I'd find. A message from Emily. Meeting's running late. Don't wait up. Love you. Love you. Those 2 words hit me like shards of glass scraping down my throat. I couldn't even respond. I just stared at the screen numb. And yet, somewhere deep inside, I already knew, with the same rock-solid certainty that I teach my students the Pythagorean theorem, that my wife wasn't stuck in any meeting. She was lying in someone else's bed. Her skin against someone else's. And the only thing left to figure out was whether I was going to keep pretending I didn't know. I always tell my algebra students the same thing. Every problem has a solution if you take it step by step. Break it down. Identify your variables. Plug them into the equation. Work through it logically and you'll get your answer. Now here I was, sitting in the wreckage of my marriage, realizing it had turned into its own kind of twisted math problem. If a woman leaves her house at 8 a.m. claiming to return at 11 p.m., but the parking garage at her office logs her car leaving at 6 p.m., where does she spend the 5 missing hours? Solve for X. The moment I decided to hire a private investigator felt like admitting something permanent had broken. Like I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. For 2 days, I drove past the old brick building that housed Sullivan Investigations. It sat on top of a bail bonds office on the gritty edge of downtown, the kind of place you pass by without looking twice. The flickering neon sign in the window pulsed like my nerves. I'd stare at it through the windshield, my hands gripping the wheel, trying to work up the nerve. On the 3rd day, I finally parked the car, stepped out, and made my way up the narrow staircase. The hall smelled like decades of cigarette smoke and things people try to forget. At the top, I pushed open a door with peeling paint and stepped inside. Jack Sullivan looked like he'd walked straight off a detective show from the 90s. Stocky build, shoulders like he'd been carrying the world for years, eyes that had seen too much. His dress shirt was wrinkled, a faded coffee stain on the pocket, and the desk between us was buried under paperwork, fast food wrappers, and manila folders. I tried to ease into the conversation with small talk, but Jack didn't play games. He leaned back in his cracked leather chair and cut straight to it. How long have you had the gut feeling? I hesitated. Then I said it aloud for the first time. 6 months, I told him. My voice felt thin, brittle. Maybe longer, if I'm being honest with myself. Just saying it, speaking it out loud to a stranger, felt like peeling off my skin in public. I told him about her patterns. Tuesdays and Thursdays suddenly full of client dinners. Her brand new gym membership at a boutique studio miles from her office, even though there was a perfectly good one just 2 blocks away. It was like describing a version of Emily I didn't even recognize anymore. That weekend conference Emily claimed she had in Chicago? The one she packed for so carefully, checking her hair twice in the mirror before heading out the door? I later found out it had been canceled weeks earlier. One of her coworkers mentioned it offhand during a casual conversation, not knowing they were lighting a match to gasoline. Jack Sullivan listened as I spoke, his expression calm, professional. He didn't flinch, didn't judge. Just kept scribbling on a yellow legal pad with the kind of focused precision that made it feel like he was drafting the obituary for my marriage. After I laid it all out, he nodded once and said, "Give me 2 weeks. Maybe less if she's sloppy. The careful ones usually take a bit longer." Emily wasn't careful. The next 14 days felt like I was starring in a drama I didn't audition for, some twisted role where I had to play the loving, oblivious husband. And I nailed it. I became an expert at pretending everything was fine. I sat on the couch grading algebra tests while she sat beside me, glued to her phone, fingers moving fast with the kind of excitement people only get when they're falling in love. I cooked dinner most nights, only to get a call or a text saying she wouldn't make it. Running late again, sorry babe. Big client pitch. She always had a reason. On the few nights she did come home, if she was in the mood, I'd hold her in bed and try not to think about who else might have been holding her before me. I told myself this was temporary, that I just needed to wait. That the truth would land in my hands soon. And it did, slowly. Painfully. Jack's updates came like a quiet, slow-spreading poison. Each message chipped away at the last bits of denial I had left. On the 3rd day he called to tell me she had lunch with someone. Mel. Early 40s. Tailored navy suit. Confident posture. That was it. Nothing too damning yet. Day 5, same guy again. This time, they left lunch and walked together to an upscale apartment building on Riverside Drive. She went inside with him. Stayed for 2 hours. Jack didn't have to say what they did. Day 8, he had photos now. "You might want to prepare yourself," he said quietly. I remember exactly where I was when the final call came. I was sitting in my car in the school parking lot. It was late, and I'd stayed behind to help a student who was struggling with polynomial equations. I had a stack of papers in the passenger seat when my phone rang. Jack's voice was steady, calm, like someone telling you a loved one had passed in their sleep. "I've got everything you asked for. Photos, video, bank records." She's been careful about hiding it, but not careful enough. The man's name was Lucas Winters. Investment banker. Goldman Sachs. High-rise apartment. Classic profile for the guy you lose your wife to. The photos came through on my phone in a locked folder. The first one nearly knocked the wind out of me. Emily sitting at a cafe table, laughing, genuinely laughing, the kind of laugh I hadn't heard from her in months. Her hand rested casually on Lucas's chest. Familiar. Possessive. Another photo. Her entering his building at 1 p.m. on a Wednesday. A day she told me she was booked solid with back-to-back meetings. Then one more, her kissing him. Out in the open. On a street corner. Middle of the day, like it meant nothing. Like I was already a ghost in her life. And then, the video. That part was worse. There was a 10-second clip, short but it hit like a hammer. Emily and Lucas stepping through the doors of a boutique hotel downtown. His hand settled on the small of her back, possessive, confident. It was the same way I used to touch her in the early days, back when we were new, when everything between us still crackled with excitement. I recognized it instantly. That kind of touch doesn't lie. I was sitting in my old Honda Civic when I watched it, my faithful no-frills car that had always done its job without complaint. Dependable. Sensible. Everything Lucas's sleek black Mercedes wasn't. And in that moment I didn't feel like I was breaking. No, something inside me was solidifying, turning cold and sharp. Not collapse. More like conversion. The heartache hardened into something more focused, more useful. Rage, I realized, could be a scalpel if you held it right. Then Jack called again. She just left the office. Heading to his place now. I didn't have to think. I didn't weigh the options. My body moved on its own, hands gripping the wheel, turning the ignition, foot hitting the gas. I knew exactly where I was going. 20 minutes to Riverside Drive. 20 minutes to the end of the story we started writing 12 years ago. I'd always taught my students the fundamentals of physics, cause and effect. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. That night, I decided Emily was going to learn that Newton's third law applies to more than just falling apples and rolling marbles. It applies to betrayal too. During those 20 minutes I had time to think. To decide what kind of man I was going to be. Would I take this quietly, let it break me in private and walk away with my dignity? Or would I burn everything down, make sure there were no winners left standing? My knuckles tightened on the steering wheel until they turned white, and my thoughts darkened with them. I pictured Lucas's nose shattering under my fist. I imagined Emily's stunned expression, the moment she'd realize I knew, as I took something from her the way she took everything from me. I thought of keys scratching paint, of torn clothing, of shouting until someone called the cops. But deep down, I knew that kind of reaction would be too easy. Too sloppy. Violence? That was for people who didn't know how to make pain last. I wasn't just a man scorned. I was a teacher. I taught kids every day that the smartest solution was rarely the loudest one. Riverside Drive was exactly what I expected it to be. Clean sidewalks. Sculpted hedges. Imported cars lining the street. The kind of place where a teacher's annual income didn't even cover the HOA fees. But I wasn't intimidated. Lucas's building had a doorman in a pressed uniform, standing tall at the glass doors. But I knew him. I taught his son 3 years ago in my sophomore algebra class. The moment he saw me, his face lit up in recognition. "Mr. Grant, what brings you to this side of town?" I smiled, calm and smooth. "Visiting a friend," I replied. "Lucas Winters. He's expecting me." He nodded without a second thought. Good kids grow up trusting their favorite teachers. And good teachers? We learn how to lie without blinking. "Penthouse B," the doorman said, gesturing toward the elevators. "Just to your right." As I stepped inside the lift and felt it start its quiet climb, it didn't feel like I was simply heading up a few floors. It felt like I was ascending toward something final, toward judgment. And I honestly wasn't sure who was about to be judged more harshly, Emily, Lucas, or me. The elevator opened onto a hallway lined with marble so polished it reflected my face in flashes as I walked. My footsteps echoed, sharp, out of place in a building like this, a building where people whispered and wore $1,000 shoes. I stopped in front of his door. Behind it, soft jazz filtered through, smooth and seductive, like it was taken straight from a bad romance script. Something sultry, low-lit and painfully cliché. I knocked 3 times. The same rhythm I used in class when I needed 30 teenagers to stop talking and focus. Sure. Measured. Final. Lucas answered. He was barefoot, wrapped in a dark silk robe that looked like it cost more than my nicest suit. The transformation on his face happened in 3 clean phases: confusion, then realization, and finally, unmistakable fear. Watching it happen was like observing someone work through a math problem they didn't want to solve. Each step bringing them closer to an answer they couldn't accept. Jake, how did you? I didn't respond. Didn't raise my voice. Didn't raise my fists. I just walked past him. Not with aggression, but with inevitability. He stumbled back a few steps as I crossed the threshold into the space like I owned it. Because in a way I did. This moment belonged to me. The living room looked like it had been set for a scene in a movie about betrayal. The lights were dimmed low. A bottle of wine sat open on the coffee table, breathing. 2 glasses, one already smudged with lipstick. And there, on the leather couch, sat Emily. My wife. Draped in the silk robe I'd given her for our anniversary, the one she'd claimed she couldn't find a month ago. Her expression was a gallery of unraveling emotions. First surprise. Then guilt. That guilt stiffened into defiance, her chin lifting, eyes narrowing. But defiance didn't hold. It collapsed into something far more desperate. Manipulation. She actually opened her mouth with, "Jake, it's not what it looks like." And then stopped. Even she realized how absurd that sounded when she was half naked in another man's apartment. She shifted gears quickly. "It just happened, Jake. I was going to tell you, I swear." My voice came out steady, eerily calm, like I was back in front of my whiteboard. "Were you going to tell me after your Thursday night meetings in Chicago? You know, during that conference that never happened? Or maybe after you finished whatever you 2 were doing in the bed I helped pay for?" Lucas tried to speak then. Took a step toward me like he had something helpful to add. "Hey man, maybe we should just." I didn't even look at him. Just raised a hand and cut him off like an error in an equation. "You're not important. You're just another variable in a formula that was always going to equal 0. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone, then followed it with a manila envelope. Divorce papers. Fresh off the printer at my lawyer's office that very afternoon. I set them down on the coffee table, right next to the half-finished glass of wine, and the moment Clara saw them, all the color drained from her face. "Drawn up by Barry Steinberg," I said evenly. "You remember Barry, don't you? Top divorce attorney in the city. We had dinner with him and his wife last Christmas. You said he gave you the chills. Called him ruthless, if I remember right." I looked her in the eye. "You were absolutely right." Clara's voice cracked when she finally found it. "Jake, please, wait. We can talk about this." "We are talking," I said. "I'm talking. You're listening. The way you should have listened back when you promised me, in front of everyone, that you'd forsake all others." Then I held up my phone, angled the camera, and snapped a photo of the 2 of them. Her still in the robe I gave her, him frozen mid-motion, hand trying to shield his face. "For the record," I said, slipping the phone back into my pocket. "Barry says documentation helps when it comes to dividing up assets. Infidelity leaves a paper trail." Just like clockwork, her tone shifted. The tears dried up, replaced with heat. Anger. She sat up straighter, chin raised. "You can't just do this," she hissed. "This is my life too." "Was your life," I corrected calmly, using the same voice I'd use when explaining to a student why their midterm grade couldn't be rounded up. "Oh, and your parents? They know. I called them about an hour ago. Your mom cried. Your dad, he wasn't even shocked. Said this isn't the first time you've done something like this. Apparently there was a situation back in college. Wish he'd brought that up before we got married." Clara's face collapsed like wet paper. "And your job?" I added, tilting my head slightly. "Well, someone sent an anonymous tip to your firm's compliance department. Something about misusing company resources. All those client dinners you've been charging to the company card. Funny how Lucas here is the only client who ever seems to show up. Fraud's a tricky thing, Clara. Hard to nail down. But once people start sniffing around, careers can unravel fast." That finally stirred Lucas. He stood up a little taller, eyes narrowing. "You're crazy. You can't just." "I can," I said, cutting him off. "And I already did." I turned to leave but paused in the doorway. "Oh, and Clara? The locks at the house have been changed. Your things are packed. They're in boxes in the garage. Pick them up tonight if you want them. Anything left tomorrow morning is getting donated to Goodwill. That was when she finally broke. The tears came, full and helpless. But I didn't stay to watch them fall. But the tears, they didn't feel real. They looked too polished, too timed, like she'd rehearsed them in the mirror just in case this moment ever came. Her voice trembled on cue. Jake, I love you. We can work through this. Counseling, therapy, whatever you need. I looked her straight in the eye. What I need is a wife who doesn't sleep with investment bankers while I'm at school teaching teenagers about integrity and honest work. I turned toward the door without waiting for her reply. Oh, and the car? I added over my shoulder. It's in both our names, but I'll handle the paperwork in the morning. You can keep it. But the loan is yours now, 72 months, 6.9% interest. Maybe Lucas can help you crunch the numbers. The last sound I heard before the door closed behind me was her voice calling my name. It cracked on the second syllable, filled with something that might have passed for remorse. But I knew better. Regret that only shows up after the lies come crashing down isn't true remorse, it's just panic. It's sorrow for being caught, not for what you did. She came home that night at 11:47 p.m. I know the exact time because I was already there, sitting in the dark living room with my laptop open, watching the live feed from the security camera pointed at the front porch. She tried her key first, 3 times. The handle jiggled. Nothing. Then she began pounding on the door with both fists. Jake, she shouted. Jake, open the door. This is my house too. I let her knock for a full 5 minutes. Just long enough for the porch light to click on. Long enough for the neighbors to peek through their blinds. Only then did I unlock the door and open it a few inches. She changed. The silk robe was gone. Now she wore jeans and the old Princeton sweatshirt she'd stolen from me back when we first moved in together. Her makeup had melted down her face, mascara smeared like war paint, like a mask coming undone. Your stuff's in the garage, I said flatly, standing firm in the doorway. Everything's labeled. I even took the time to bubble wrap your grandmother's china. Clara stepped forward and pressed her hand against my arm, trying to push past me. You can't just shut me out of our home, she said, voice rising. This is our house. I said, keeping my tone even. And legally I can. You abandoned the marital residence to commit adultery. Barry's words, not mine. She pushed harder against my arm, eyes wide with disbelief. I didn't move an inch. She tried again. We need to talk, she said, voice raw. Please just let me talk. I stepped aside, motioned toward the couch. Fine. Talk. What followed was an hour-long performance, one I'd seen coming. It was like watching a play you've already read the script for. Every act unfolded with perfect predictability. I listened carefully, not with hope, but with analysis, like a scientist watching a chemical reaction he's observed 100 times before. Act 1, the tears. Big, glistening drops sliding down her cheeks. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I don't know what I was thinking. It meant nothing. Without a word, I reached for my folder and laid out the credit card statements Jack Sullivan had dug up. The lingerie from Agent Provocateur. The weekend trips to the Hamptons. The $3,000 watch she'd bought for Lucas's birthday. If that was nothing, I said, then you have a very expensive definition of meaningless. Act 2 followed right on cue, anger and blame. You were never home, she snapped. You were always at school, grading, chaperoning events. I was lonely. I nodded slowly. And I offered to cut back on everything, remember? But you told me we couldn't afford it. Said we needed the extra money to take your dream vacation to Bali. I leaned forward. Interesting then that Jack found confirmation emails for that same trip, with Lucas's name on the itinerary. Her face faltered. Then came Act 3, bargaining. Please Jake, we can fix this. I'll quit my job. We can move, somewhere new. Just the two of us. Start over. I pulled out my phone and tapped to open the screenshots Jack had sent. I turned the screen toward her. Messages from her to Lucas. 3 months of them. Line after line of her saying she just needed to position things right. That she'd leave me once bonus season was over. You weren't planning a fresh start, I said. You were waiting for a paycheck. And finally the last act, desperation. Don't you remember our wedding? She whispered. Santorini? The cliffs? The olive tree? When my dad had his heart attack and you stayed by my side for 3 days without sleeping? I stared at her. Yeah. I remember everything. I stood slowly, voice flat but steady. I remember you promising to love and cherish. I remember you swearing Lucas was just a client. And I remember last Tuesday when you said you had a late pitch meeting downtown, but instead, you spent the evening in his apartment. I have timestamps, Clara, I said calmly. Receipts. Screenshots. Photos. Even your location data from the Find My Phone app, the one you forgot we still had linked. That broke her. She sank down onto the front steps, her shoulders folding in on themselves like she'd been physically hit. For a fleeting moment, I saw a version of her I hadn't seen in years, the woman I once fell in love with. There was something raw in her then. Lost. Fragile. Still beautiful in a way that twisted something in my chest. But that version of her didn't exist anymore. She was just a ghost now. And I was finally done living with ghosts. Your parents are waiting, I said quietly. Your mom made up your old bedroom. Clara looked up at me with vacant eyes, like all the light had drained out of them. You told them? She whispered. Enough, I replied. They're disappointed, sure. But not surprised. Apparently, this isn't the first time. Her voice came out even smaller. What about work? Did you really? HR should be reaching out soon, I said. They'll probably want to go over your expense reports in detail. I'd recommend getting a lawyer. She stood, shakily, as if her bones were trying to remember how to hold her up. She squared her shoulders, just barely, and gave me a look that tried to muster some dignity. I suppose you want the ring back, she said bitterly. Keep it, I told her. Sell it. Give it to Lucas. It means nothing now. Then she hit me with her final accusation. Her voice sharp and bitter, like she was spitting broken glass. You're enjoying this. You're enjoying destroying me. I shook my head. No. I'm just relieved. And I meant it. For 6 months I've been second-guessing myself. Walking around like a ghost, wondering if I was paranoid, insecure, jealous. Thinking maybe I was losing my mind. Turns out I wasn't broken. I was just right. I stepped back inside and returned with her car keys and the boxes I'd packed earlier that day, each one carefully labeled. Clothes, toiletries, books, lies you told. That last box held the artifacts of what used to be us. Our wedding album, the love notes she wrote me during finals week, the vow renewal cards we exchanged at year 5. I didn't know what she'd do with them. I didn't care. That decision was hers now. As she silently loaded everything into the trunk of her car, she paused at the driver's side door and glanced over her shoulder. What about Lucas? She asked, her voice soft, almost afraid. Are you going to ruin his life too? I didn't answer. Just stood there in the doorway of a house that suddenly felt enormous, echoing with silence, filled with memories I hadn't decided whether to keep or erase. But for the first time in half a year I could take a full breath. And it didn't feel like I was drowning anymore. 6 months later, I found myself standing on the balcony of my apartment, watching the sun rise slowly over the river, its golden light spilling across the water like forgiveness. The mug in my hands was warm, dark roast, no sugar. No compromise. Just the way I liked it. The place I lived in now was a far cry from the house we used to share. Smaller. Simpler. But every square foot of it was mine. No ghosts lurking in closets. No echoes of whispered apologies or perfume in the curtains. It was quiet. Honest. Clean. The divorce had gone through. Final. Neat. She'd left her job quietly, resignation letter and NDA in hand. I didn't celebrate. But I didn't lose sleep over it either. At school things had shifted too. The way my coworkers looked at me had changed. The pity had faded, replaced with a kind of quiet respect. Maybe it was the way I carried myself now. Or maybe it was just time. My students, always the first to sense what adults try to hide, had picked up on it too. Something in me was different. Stronger maybe. More real. I still taught them math, but I also started telling them the truth. Not just about solving for X, but about life. About how people will disappoint you. About how not every problem can be fixed. And sometimes the best thing you can do is set down the pencil and walk away from the equation entirely. Last week, a student stayed after class. Asked me if it ever gets better. I told him it does. Slowly. Not all at once. But it does. A few weekends ago I traveled alone. No itinerary. Just curiosity. And I ended up back in Santorini. There, among the cliffs and blue dome churches, I found the old olive tree again, the one we carved into all those years ago. Jake plus Emily forever still etched deep into the bark. I ran my fingers over it for a moment, not with sorrow, not with nostalgia, just a kind of detached curiosity. Like an archaeologist uncovering some remnant of a forgotten civilization. Meant nothing now. Just an old promise from two people who no longer existed. The tree though, it was still standing. It had been there long before us. and it would be there long after. Our forever had lasted 12 years. And in the bigger picture, that wasn't even a season. Just a passing weather system in the long stretch of a life. I stood there by the tree for a while, staring at those old letters carved into bark. I thought about carving something new, maybe even scraping out the initials we'd once believed were permanent. But I didn't. There was no need. That moment, that version of me, it was gone. And it had taught me enough. Instead of rewriting the past, I chose to build something honest from the rubble. A life that was real. I was a better teacher now. More open. More grounded. I knew how to spot the difference between something that looked perfect and something that was. Maybe that's why I'd found someone like Sarah. Yes, Sarah. Not a rebound. Not a replacement. A beginning. Someone who knew what it was to be hurt and still show up anyway. My phone buzzed. A text from her lit up the screen. Dinner tonight. My place. I promised not to bail with a last-minute client emergency. I smiled. We could joke about it now. The wreckage that had led us here, the broken pieces of other stories we didn't need to hide from. I texted back, only if you promise not to expense it. The sun finished its rise, casting long golden shadows across the floor as I stepped back inside. The warmth followed me. The ashes of what someone else had burned down were still there, in pieces, in memory, but from them I'd rebuilt something. Not perfect, not flawless, but real. The coffee was still hot in my hand. Still strong. Still exactly how I liked it. The sunrise was over. But the day, my day, was just beginning. And for the first time in a long time, this imperfect life? It was perfectly mine. Dear listeners, if this story spoke to you, please share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from those who've walked similar roads. And if you found something real in these words, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time.